I don't know much I can teach you about rockets. I'm kind of more of a rocket nerd than a rocket scientist. But I'm a kid of the 60s and the 70s. So when I was a little kid, my family went to Florida and we saw this thing, which is a pretty amazing invention, engineering, technology. And I was pretty enamored with it. And until I met, so if you don't know what this is called the crawler. You can see the size of it. It rolls out on this special rock, and it's moved out the Saturn V giant rocket. Always pretty impressed with it, but it took a really long time to get it out to the launch pad. And then I met this young kid that knew a lot about a different space program with which this one competed, who drove the rocket out sideways and just lowered the base and let gravity stand the rocket up, which is exactly how the Egyptians lifted the pylons. And I thought, well, that's really fascinating, and I spent a lot of time down there, and so I thought maybe gravity as a metaphor, because I feel like I work at a lot of places where people want to do the right thing. They want to be successful, but there's either mass that they've collected or structural gravity that's holding them down. Dude's law is sort of bad science or moderate science. I don't have a physics background, so I have a musical background, so this is going to be sort of play school physics or musical physics of sorts. So Dude's law was this joke I came up with, which says value is equal to y divided by how. And then, of course, one of my math buddies immediately told me that in my equation, how couldn't equal 0. And I said, dude, when how goes to 0, you get infinite value. And that actually resonates for me, because that's sort of what I want to talk about. Is I've been listening to people's talks, and there's an open space discussion. I feel like one of the conversations we're sort of getting ready to have is how much process is enough? Or I should say, we're getting ready to have it again. So as a vehicle, I wanted to compare these two books. So I don't know if you've read either one of these books. This is a sweet book right here. This is, from what I understand, this woman went out and did a bunch of interviews with companies that were all deemed startup. But if you look at the names of the companies, calling them startups sort of seems crazy. She's I think she works for Paul Graham's organization, Y Combinator. And what I thought was neat about the book is they're just interviews. So one of the best interviews in the book is with Steve Wozniak, who basically tells the story of accidentally inventing color for the Apple IIe because he ran out of chips. Steve Wozniak, who worked on calculators for HP, and thought, well, there's this Steve Jobs guy, and he's kind of interesting, but I got my calculator job, so I'm all good for life. And the theme through this book is what we started out doing is not what we ended up doing. What we thought was going to be valuable, it wasn't actually where the real value was, across the board. And I think one of the words that I'm more interested right now is, instead of agile or not, or Scrum or Kanban or whatever, is certainty and uncertainty. Because I think some of the deeper myths that I fight are, we have our backlog, now we just have to get it done. We have our requirements, now we just have to build them. I'm pretty sure the word just is the worst estimate anyone gives anybody else. You got the system and you just have to rebuild it. This book over here is the opposite. He's talking about how great ideas don't get they don't reach escape velocity in certain organizations. It talks about more than that, because they sort of get sucked back down to the ground by the gravity of the organization. So started me thinking, oh, that's an interesting way to look at things. So I kind of just came up with this dumb little graph, and I'm thinking, like, up here is product learning, and up here is usage learning, and up here is uncertainty and unknown. And this is the dimension where I see people being successful with agile methods, not because of agile methods. In large organizations, there is structure. A company of 100,000 doesn't get to act, or doesn't typically act, like a company of 10. So I'm not saying structure is bad. So structure I would define as process is structure, or architecture, or HR, or roles. There's all these things that are structural, and when the structure becomes more important than learning from what you're producing, you get what Fred Brooks once called accidental complexity. And Fred Brooks was talking about accidental complexity in the form of architectural debt that isn't providing any value. And I like that term because it's accidental. And then I was working at Intel. Intel has 100,000 plus people, and they're trying to figure out, how do we actually become a product company instead of a chip manufacturer? And how do we introduce this Agile stuff in a way where it's lasting? I think their coaching group is one of the smarter coaching groups I've met. And one of the people said, you don't mean accidental, you mean incidental. Then I really thought, this is excellent. This is what happens in organizations where people are chasing the myth of enterprise agility, or enterprise anything for that matter. And so here's some of those things that pop up that weigh people down. That's the gravity that pulls people off that dimension of product learning, which is where the uncertainty is, the unknown is, the pivots, the changes happen that you don't control, even if you're sure, you're certain you know what's needed. So small company sits on that axis. We work at DevJam, we work with big giant distributed organizations, and we work with small companies of 10 or less. 10 people that get along, that like each other, that have good skills, that have a passion for what they're building, don't need much process. You put them in a process box and you crush innovation, because that group shouldn't be talking about their process, they should be talking about their product. Then you have, not knowing how to say it, maybe a larger program. Large doesn't have to be more than 40. I think, humans don't scale linear. That's why twins are more than twice as hard. So as soon as what I see is, it's interesting, a small organization goes from 10 people to 20, and then usually there's a separation, and the management group moves up to the higher floors, kind of like hill people someplace, and there's not this kind of level space. So a larger group, there's going to be some structure. Now the question is, how much structure? And one of the things I hear talked about all the time in the Agile space is, how do we scale Agile for 100,000 people? Why do you want to do anything with 100,000 people? What have 100,000 people ever collectively done that was really fascinating spontaneously in a short period of time? It's pretty rare. So structure isn't necessarily bad unless it's accidental or incidentally accidental. Because we work with medical device groups. And if you're helping to coach a team that's going to put a device inside someone you care about, you actually care about testing. The medical device gigs that I've been on, the difference is that people don't lie about testing. There's high governance. Now, I started programming in the 90s, and I did a lot of C++ in the 90s, and it was sort of a social norm to lie to each other. So we would say things like, hey man, did you test that? And the other person would say, oh yeah, I tested that for sure. And it was just kind of okay, and we knew we were lying to each other, but we did it anyways, until I started working for Medtronic. And there was this governance body called the FDA. And if they figured out that there wasn't a parallelization between what we said we were going to build and how we were going to test it, it didn't matter how good it was, the product got taken off the market. So there are some structural things that you maybe can't avoid. And then there's the structure of what I would call enterprise everything. It's interesting. At some point in time, maybe in the 80s or the 90s, we started prepending everything with the word enterprise. Now we're prepending everything with the word agile. There's an inverse relationship between the number of times you say agile every day and how agile you actually are. Because musicians don't get together and have meetings about B flat. right? It sort of is, you know. I once did a talk called "Shut Up and Play Your Guitar" based on an album that Frank Zappa put out. Because like the parallels that could exist that don't exist often enough between music and software is it's what you produce, not how you've produced it. You don't care when you go to see someone great play how their rehearsals went, or even how their instruments are set up. You're there to experience it, just like the people we're producing things for are there to experience those. So I wanted to just kind of jokingly go through what I'm going to call like 4 lessons in gravity. And the first one is mass has consequence. So this middle book is my favorite one that I get often. Not from my friend Mary, but from other people. I'll get a 500-page book on lean. That's funny, right? 500 pages. It has a chapter called Write Less Code. I'm like, that's a great idea. I didn't think of that. I'm trying to write more code. Then there's like, how do you do it? So the irony kills me, and I want to ask you guys to think about this for a second. So this is not going to be just a keynote. It's going to be sort of a combination of a presentation and a workshop. So we're going to call it a workshoptation, where we're going to put those two together because I want you to leave thinking about kind of what you've heard over the last 2 days. And the first one is this idea of like, how much process mass have you accumulated? So people say to me, we're trying to do pure Agile, or pure Scrum, or pure XP. And I sort of feel like that's like chasing the myth of pure democracy. Redefining democracy or boasting about how well you do it is not the point. The results are there when you go into a society. So thinking of that, you know, we've had a lot of processes. We had XP, we had Scrum, and we have Kanban. And we still have people having this dumb argument about, you got your Scrum in my Kanban, and all that kind of stuff. So I created a new process called non-ban. So non-ban, if you've ever had naan bread, I emailed an Indian friend of mine, and I said, actually called him up, I said, would you ever serve a meal that didn't have naan? He said, probably not. I said, would you ever serve a meal that was only naan? And he said no. And I thought, that's it, right? Because process is not the sustenance, it's just part of the meal. So I chose the words really carefully. Well, first of all, you can't go to nonbog.org because this process is so lean it doesn't have a website. It's the world's lightest process. And if you go there, it's just a dead URL. But I like this idea. The least amount of process with the most real and measurable value. That doesn't say, I'm not saying process is bad. I'm not saying you shouldn't have any. Some of the places where I see people the most productive and the most fulfilled are very disciplined. And their process wouldn't work at a lot of other organizations because they don't have that rigor. So to try and promote my weird idea, I made these for you guys so someone can hand them out. Yes, Peter has them here. They're little non-bond stickers. So if you want to go forth and promote that, you can have, stickers are a big deal. Like every programmer I have at DevJam has stickers all over their computers. So I thought this would be funny. You don't have to take a pledge. You don't have to bark. You don't have to do anything other than sort of promise to say, challenge the amount of process relative to the value it's producing. Okay, so that's your first question, is like, how much process mass do you have? Another one would be, how overly certain are you? So hopefully no one here worked on this, and they don't feel necessarily bad. But you can imagine the people that designed this were pretty proud of it. Look at it, it's beautiful. Obviously it's going to sell. The last speaker was talking about exactly this. And the joke that I've kind of come up with to talk about that is product arrogance. And I like that term. I stole it from an author that talks about epistemic arrogance, being the difference between what you know and what you think you know. So product arrogance is the difference between what people need and what you're sure they need. Or tragically, what's required. That's a damaging word that just lives on and on. So that's another thing you can consider, the word requirement. Jeff Patton is a friend I met because we both had been answering the same question for like 10 years. What's a story? Show me a story. Is that a story? And Jeff and I were giving people the same answer, like, they're all stories, and if you put them together, they should tell one big story, and if they don't, then they're not meaningful stories. What I've seen is that people are looking for how to write a story. And the reality is, if you don't have a good story to tell, writing it down doesn't help. No matter how good the grammar is, it doesn't matter. So it's like the story. Does anybody know what stories were called a long time ago before they became user stories? They were actually tied to a physical medium. And there was this idea of a story card. And it was such a big difference because it was this token. And it started a conversation, which was, do I understand what you're asking for? Not always, but when it worked, that's what worked really well about it. Another one would be, what's your meeting mass? So I have this idea I practice called test-driven meeting, which means, and apparently Steve Jobs used to do this. He'd walk into the room and say, why are you here? Why are you here? Why are you here? Why are you here? Once he knew what the meeting was about, he would just politely disinvite half the people in the room. I'm going to have to ask you to leave, and you, thanks for showing up. So I've been working at this. I've been working with a huge organization, to be unnamed, which has offices in California and Florida. I'll let you figure it out from there because I can say that legally. And they purchased a small group. The small group acts like a small company, because it was a small company. We went into a meeting, we came out of a meeting, it was sort of a frustrating meeting, and someone published the cost of the meeting. Just took everyone's run rate, multiplied it times the time we sat in the room, and kind of said that was a $7,000 meeting. And I'm not sure if that's a good way to drive the right behavior, but it was fascinating to think, we just wasted $7,000 because that was a stupid discussion. And we didn't actually ask, what were we trying to get out of it? So that's an idea that I haven't had a lot of luck having it stick at larger organizations. But I'm pretty intense about, like, what are we trying to talk about? What does success look like at the end of this meeting? Even the word meeting's a little bit heavy. And the last one before the workshop-tation starts would be like, what's your mass of bright, shiny object? So I was just up in the open space, and Git came up. And I'm a fan. We use it on a lot of projects. But I remember when Git became popular, I heard all these programmers say, well, we have to use Git. And I thought, no, I don't think we have to, right? We have to breathe. We have to eat. We have to do a couple other bodily functions. But we don't have to use Git. You want to use Git. Now, the people that I saw using it effectively right away, especially early on, were these teams that were already doing what people call feature toggles right now. So the first time I saw it effectively used, someone fed a story into a group of people. And there was an argument about how to build it. And the person that was asking the group to build this stuff had so much trust in the team that they just kind of looked at the two bits of investment and said, let's try both of them. Because if all in, one's 5,000 and one's 10,000, and the upside is $500,000, that's a good risk. And that's kind of some of the language I see happening that's more exciting, is people talking about investment instead of budgets. That's a very subtle distinction. But where there's more trust in delivery, people are willing to look at, say, what is the next best investment instead of, can we get stuff done in a sprint? That's, if you can't, right, you need to work on that. But once you start getting stuff done, you're forced with a tougher question, more ambiguous, where there's more uncertainty. It's like, are we building the right thing? Is that the right investment? So what I want you to do is just turn to the person next to you. If you want to be rebellious, get up and walk around. I'm going to induce 5 minutes of chaos where you actually contemplate how much mass you've collected. It's your spaceship, and you've brought all this garbage in. What could you jettison and go faster, or let your ideas reach escape velocity? Okay, 5 minutes of chaos begins now. Go. Just because we started late, I want to make sure you guys get out of here at time. The end of the day at Dev Jam, we practice what we call a beer-rospective, which is where all the really great discussions start. But I want to challenge you to say, these are things you can change. So I sometimes, I don't know the right word to use, but I hear people kind of talk to me like sort of in this victim language, like things are happening to me. And I know some things you can't change. But you know, changing some of these things, that was the focus, probably the thing that drew me to extreme programming was like embrace change. Let's do things different. And I think there's a little bit of a myth out there that as a coach you're supposed to be loved. If you think about like some of the best coaches you've had, you didn't necessarily love them all the time, but you respected them because they respectfully challenged you. So I respectfully challenge you to say, what mass have you taken on that's incidental, accidental, or structure that you maybe don't need? Because the next stuff is the stuff that you can't change. I saw this woman speak at a conference close to Minneapolis where I live. She's this brilliant physicist. She was talking about how the universe started, then a bunch of physicists started having those physicist arguments. This one guy said, well, how do you know how the universe started? You weren't there. And she started walking through telling the story, and it was the language of science, which is test-driven. Hypothesize, experiment, change your result. You know, modify your results, change your hypothesis, and keep experimenting. And at one point she said, I think we need to all remember that gravity is a theory. It's a pretty well-tested theory, so if you jump off the building, the results are fairly known. But it's a theory, and I loved what she said because she was very much a process-based perspective. It's the theory we're going to use until it's disproved or we find a better one. And that's not someone that's become rigid who lives in a world that's massively complex. So the next question was like, what's the gravity like on your planet? 10 people in a startup have far less gravity than 10 people in a 100,000 person company. And I just end up using this language of like, what are the constraints? People ask me questions of like, how can you do Agile with distributed groups? We as a group up in the open space just had a discussion of how do you do this when you have large old systems that aren't tested. Those are all just some variant set of constraints, a word you could replace with realities. Like how are these processes really gonna help you with the realities that you're facing? So one of which is this idea of roles, which is still a big deal publicly at organizations where you can't just ignore it. But there's some kind of covert ops, or civil disobedience was the word I was using in the open space. So here's a question you can think of. When there's more testing to be done, how often does everybody stop and test? So that's the difference between what I see when I'm working in the States is working at a bank versus working at a gaming company. At a gaming company, everybody stops on Fridays to play the game together. At a bank, the programmers never stop to kind of play banker. So the problem is they become sort of divorced from that experience. They're sure their code is good. They're maybe mythically certain that the requirements are correct. And I don't think stories meant let's act like waiters where we just take orders and get them done every sprint. They were like a challenge to kind of say let's have a dialogue that goes beyond the specification or the requirement that's there. And I mean the way that's sort of played out is that, just simply put, one of the good things that's happened is if you draw stacks of people and you just kind of put a simple stack together, developers, testers, and BAs, I mean by and large where people have been successful, you've seen, you know, these feature teams or full stack teams, they have all sorts of names pop up. And that's happened in a lot of situations. Now, there's still people that people can't figure out what to do with. So this is one of the crowds I run into all the time, the architects or the UX people. And now, I sort of feel like there's a pattern there where what happened with a lot of the architects that I used to work with, which just gave mandates to development teams who showed that they weren't meaningful, the mandates, is architecture became a skill instead of a job. More people need to understand more parts of the system so we can be more adaptive. I think the UX stuff is interesting in that it's a little bit different, you know, because one of the things we did effectively is I think we took like development and testing, we busted them up into small chunks and we were able to interleave them because the nature of development and testing is you can break things into small testable pieces. User experience stuff isn't quite like that. And then there's the blur between what does it mean to do user interface, beautiful design presentation versus interactions in the form of user experience? And so the drawing and sketching stuff over here and the coding stuff over here are both in that 10,000 hours. You have to mess it up a bunch of times before you get good at it. But I feel like the 21st century software engineer needs to morph into a product developer where they can speak to interactions. They can tell those stories. They're not waiting for work units to get done in 2 weeks. And if you want to know what I mean by that, like one of my friends is an architect, and he said, draw a circle for me. And so I tried to draw him a circle, and it was a bad circle. I'm bad at circles. And he said, now wave your hand over the screen until you can see the circle, and then draw a circle. I'm not proving the point very well. Then he said, okay, I want you to draw 100 circles. I was like, ick, that sounds uninteresting. I'd rather code. After I drew about 20 circles, just like after you write a bunch of code, they got consistently better because I hadn't practiced that. I didn't have a lot of memory muscle around sketching. So I'm trying to get more people to start doing sketching as a way to be more expressive. And I see that popping up in places where people are shifting from software engineer to product developer. So that's an example. Scale is another one of these gravities that happens in companies. And so what I think is messed up with the word scale is a lot of times people say scale, and what they mean is they mean spread. How do we spread this instead of scaling? Now, if you just say scale and it represents volume, in order to build this complex system, this morning I spent time writing a product design course for a company that builds a very complex testing product that has 20 teams. And it's very hard to slice the product across a bunch of feature teams because there's certain people that do the algorithms for the test, and that's not an easy skill set to generalize, so that's a constraint they have. But we're not trying to worry about scaling Agile. I think that's kind of one of the mistakes, is we want to show evidence of success in pockets and then spread this stuff. So if you end up building these whole teams, this is one of the things that popped up in most places where people were doing things at scale, and just say these are feature teams or full stack teams. Right? By and large, that's where I see success because people are able, they're organized around the dimension that has the most ambiguity and uncertainty. They're organized around their ability to pivot to the stuff that's going to change. But what the aspect-oriented community once called cross-cutting concerns don't go away. So UX might be a cross-cutting concern. Architecture might be a cross-cutting concern. Concurrency, security. There's a bunch of things that are often inappropriately written as a story for a team, and when there's a product being built by many teams, which is a much more interesting and simple language than saying safe, those cross-cutting concerns kind of don't go away. They're a pretty fundamental thing. So we have a super simple model that we use where we'll get leadership group together, and like just if you want to use a simple example, say it's a 2-week iteration, we'll talk for maybe 60 minutes around what are the goals? What are the outcomes we're looking for across all these teams? This is where, like for instance, one of those cross-cutting concerns are represented by an architect or a UX person or a product manager. So now we got these teams down here, and in this space, I don't care if they do Scrum or Kanban or non-ban. I don't really care as long as they're somehow synchronized because multiple teams are building a product. And that's the thing that's messed up in a lot of situations is you have this team saying, our story in this sprint. And I always tell those teams, especially I work on these big retail systems, these .coms, and I say, my mom doesn't care about your story or your team or your sprint. She doesn't like shopping on your site. So it sort of doesn't matter. All that process stuff is just noise. She doesn't really think about it. Now what we've done is taken like a cross-section of people. This is a really simple model. I didn't invent this. I was one of many people that stumbled on it. Someone that's thinking product and someone that's thinking tech. And they're listening here and they're bringing it back into this discussion. So this group could get their planning done really fast because they're a small, highly collaborative group, or they could be new and they maybe stumble through it for a few hours. And then we get this leadership group back together and we talk about like the dependencies and the constraints. What's going to stop us as a collective group from building a product and user experience that cuts across teams? And that's a discussion that's not being had enough. And I sort of feel like what I don't like about SAFe, or the problem I see, is all it does is synchronize delivery. It doesn't really normalize product and user experience learning across teams. Because it might be that this group is like the producer to these consumers. And these consumers don't have much, that those squiggly lines represent what their dependencies are on each other. If that group is the one that everybody's dependent on, that's the slowest moving thing in some cycle that you're trying to kind of learn inside of, and that's the discovery that's kind of missing in a lot of cross-team planning. The enterprise blah 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 stuff is also pretty significant. So there's a group in Minneapolis, apparently Mary was talking about it, called Code 42. They build a backup solution. It was started by a small group of people, maybe 8, I can't remember, and they built kind of the core IP, the go faster code. And when we worked with them last at DevJam, what I thought was cool is they had 3 products. So their product is called CrashPlan, and they had CrashPlan iOS, CrashPlan Android, and web. Now they didn't want their product running on an Android device, they wanted an Android version of their product, which is a very different piece. So maybe the naive Agilist would just slice through that core team. They would say, that's not Agile, which is sort of funny. And they would say, you should structure it like this, because that once worked really well for me on an Agile project. And now you're like following the process and instead of trying to figure out, those 8 people own that core IP. You can't just chuck someone new into that code and have everything turn out wonderful. That is fundamentally the essence of their product. So that becomes a constraint that you work inside of. Now, this is a very simple example. In the situation I was telling you about this morning, when there's 20 teams, there's no right answer. There's no generalized answer. What there is the danger of letting accidental complexity weigh you down. That's what doesn't happen, and that's often what happens when people make their choices of how to do this work too much based on process instead of product. I sort of feel like the 90s was the decade of project, 2000s were the decade of process, and this decade is the decade of product. You know, we have to stop talking about when will it be done, how we're going to do it, and start looking at the results we're producing. That's what I see where people are more successful. Now, that's not always easy. So one of the places that, you know, I was talking about medical devices. So the medical device world has brutal, brutal constraints because they'll have hardware, firmware, and software. And what's interesting is that a lot of the medical devices companies that I've been in had small groups trying to synchronize across that. And one of the areas where they could kind of build those teams was like here. But hardware was hard. It's a little bit harder. Now the hearing aid world was able to use things like 3D printers to try and make printing physical things faster or more fluid so they could move in that direction. But one of the things we've been working with Boston Scientific is to say, it doesn't matter if the hardware is right if the product idea is wrong. So how do we work inside that context? And one of my favorite examples was this small medical device company that we worked with that had a fabrication shop right across the street. So I had 3 mechanical engineers working with an electrical engineer and 2 software engineers, and we wrote a story which was mostly about fabrication. And I looked at one of the mechanical engineers and I said, how do you think we're going to test that story? And the guy looks at me and goes, I think it should be about this big. It was excellent, right? Because that was the nature of learning, was the physicality of producing the product. The software was actually secondary for that. And so it's very possible. And again, you know, you'd want to do that because even in the pacemaker space, it's like, which competition? What have people churned out lately? And if your cycle is maybe 12 months because it's a medical device for getting through something like the FDA, that's a brutal constraint. Now, that specialization is very different than more tragic specializations where, for instance, this is one of my favorite ones still, there's the Java people. And now, sadly, there's the JavaScript people. And then back here are the SAP people. You know, the slowest moving thing on the planet, SAP evolves at a glacial rate. If you say to an SAP team, let's get something done in a week, everybody just stops breathing. But it's the whole JavaScript delineation is fascinating to me. So we're doing all sorts of stuff with Go Faster JavaScript, and there's a new framework that kind of comes out every week. And at DevJam, the people we've stopped hiring are PHP people that learn JavaScript. And the people we've started hiring are people that are polyglots that know multiple languages that are interested in JavaScript. Because, as an example, those are the group of people that allow us to cut like this, cut on that same product dimension. So I sort of feel like that's a false specialization, you know, or it's a skill specialization that you can invest in and possibly do something about. And then there's the gravity that's hard to deal with, the IRS. As an example, some of the most damaging behavior that I see comes from a funding model that anonymously washes over everybody that wants to do the right thing. And somewhere in the background there's this pressure that's pushing us of like, well, that project's funded, why aren't you started? Because we don't know what we're doing. So we can sprint and spend your money for like 4 iterations. And if they're, you know, if we have continuous integration automation, we can write a lot of the wrong code even faster. If you want to celebrate that, we can even put together a burn-up chart for you. But it's tough, and a lot of that, I've actually dug way into it in the States, or companies that are based in the States. A lot of that stuff comes from how things are funded based on the tax structures in the government. And you can say Agile all day long to the IRS and it just bounces off all of them. So you have to kind of just say, how do we do this shell game and get the money that we need and then spend it how, you know, it's showing the most value. That's your best weapon. So I was going to ask you to think about this, because I do want you to kind of say, what can you and can't you change in this space? A lot of the big companies I work in, there's myths about what they have to do for some governance. And when you actually go look at the governance, they're doing more than what the governance group asks for. And I know that specifically because I was part of a group of people that audited a paper written about how to use Agile methods with medical devices, with the FDA, and across 3 large medical device companies in the States. All of them were doing more than what the FDA said they needed to do, because internally there was this myth of what we have to do for governance. No one knew the facts. So there are some things you can change here. There's other things that are brutal. Most large organizations we work in, their environments are a disaster. They're costly, they're slow, they're non-predictive, and the one thing they can possibly control, because that is a solved space, as opposed to the product stuff, which is not a solved space, they either don't have the energy, the discipline, or the investment, and the investment's a tougher one. I lose that battle all the time, usually because I'm not speaking the right language to the people that I need to win over. 15 years into being a coach in the Agile space, I sort of feel like I've become the Agile accountant sometimes, which just sort of makes me want to weep openly. But if I can't speak the language of investment to the people that are trying to give me money, then I lose that story, even if I have the right evidence. So I want to go through just like 2 more lessons. Has anybody ever heard of this, Gordon the Misguided Missile? If you look it up, it's super funny. It's John Cleese from Monty Python. And it's a story, apparently I think his mother told him about this missile that takes off, and it's headed in a direction. But it's a very stupid missile because it keeps making these small course corrections along the way. And it's pretty much John Cleese, much more funny than I am, telling the Agile story before that word was popular. And so I think like the ideas have been around for a long time. But what's funny is that I meet a lot of people that are worried about how much velocity they have. And when you hear them talk, they don't get that velocity has speed and direction, vector. It's not about just going fast. It's about going faster towards somewhere. And so if you say velocity could be reframed as it once was, as producing more value instead of just going faster, I'm going to give you 15 seconds, And I want you to think of one thing you could do tomorrow to produce more real velocity, measured as in we're producing more value, not just getting more done. Okay? Just think of one thing. Hopefully that shouldn't take you too long. Okay. Raise your hand if you thought about taking something away. Okay, so that's interesting. That's kind of what I see a lot of times is people assume that adding process allows them to get more done. Whereas I think what Taleb, this is one of my favorite authors of these days because he studied prediction a lot, talks about this idea of antifragile, which I think is an interesting word, especially because the word agile is buried in there somewhere. And Taleb's argument is that there isn't an opposite of fragile. Fragile defined as a nice wine glass. A lot of people say the opposite is robust. Robust defined as a washing machine. You throw the wine glass at the washing machine, it shatters. Anti-fragile is a human, because you can't give the washing machine an injection of a small amount of a virus and have it build up an immunity. It doesn't really know how to do that. And I think that this book is really wonderful. His writing feels like it's more powerful writing about Agile than most Agile books, because he's talking about adaptive systems, social, dynamic, all sorts of different systems. And he talks about this idea of subtractionists. Now, I don't hear a lot of people in the retrospectives often talking about what they're going to take away. The other thing I don't hear people talking about that I've been trying to think about people to say is, how wrong were you in the last iteration? Start calculating your wrong points. Man, let's celebrate. We had 15 wrong points. That's something that if you say it to a lot of companies, they're just even scared to say it out loud, which means they're unaware of how wrong they are and maybe living too much of that mythical certainty. So I can't necessarily tell you what to do. I want to end by telling you what I'm doing. So I sort of feel like, where there's just velocity and no direction, there's often kind of a mission missing. This is actually from Mission Control. Pretty interesting. They went and got all the geeks' shirts that they wore when they launched the rockets. If you're a rocket nerd, this is like your nirvana space. So I want to just throw out a funny physics joke. I had a physics professor that whenever he taught us complex things, he would always say, assume acceleration is a constant. Because if you think about that and all this other stuff we're going to talk about, your head's going to blow up. And I just want to, for a few minutes, assume that you've been using Agile methods, you practiced pretty hard, you've maybe made some investments in your environments and your builds, and let's assume acceleration or velocity is a constant. You've smoothed things out. You're a machine that is producing some things. So with that as a given, this is the change that I would sort of introduce into your world. I'd shift from these things over here to these things over here. And I want to walk through and show you some of those things. So in my little universe at DevJam, we have teams of 4 product developers and 1 producer. And I stole that language directly from the creative community, because I like the metaphor of producer is I'm there to help these group of people produce things. I like the idea of product developer because it just washes away tester, analyst, programmer, software engineer. So a lot of the people at DevJam have multiple skills. All the programmers do user advocacy testing. They're all expected to be able to kind of tell the story of the use, the product. So this is an example. So what you're going to see in a lot of these pictures is this idea of a story map. It's a collection of stories it's not an epic. It's not big things decomposed into small things. There's someone that's trying to do something, and this is one user experience. And this is possibly a second user experience. It doesn't in any way diminish the importance of stories as small testable things that help us learn. It's just the next level out a little bit I would call these little red lines like minimum viable learning. I could put that in front of someone and it would be a whole user experience. Now if that's one story, that's wonderful. Those aren't mutually exclusive. There was a bigger map up here. This is actually one of our teams, and they just took away all the rest of the stories. So what we're trying to do more and more is focus on what is it that we want to learn about the use in the product, and then secondarily, what sizes are those, or what can we get done in 2 weeks or a week? Because that's secondary information planning to, like, you know, our primary goal is to not get more points done in a sprint. It's to learn more about what we don't know. And this is kind of one of the things I think it's not happening as much, is over here on this side is the land of delivery. And a lot of groups are not, they're stumbling, or they're not making product choices. Their backlogs are pretty much just big to-do lists. And the idea of product has been stripped off. So now that's where mythical certainty comes from, because they're sure they're getting things done in sprints, and they're pretty sure that that's valuable. Instead of kind of having a different discussion of saying, okay, well, if this is raw discovery over here, and this is all delivery over here, here's a question for you guys to leave pondering. How much time are you going to spend here versus here? It's a way more interesting discussion than Agile versus Waterfall. If you compared Agile and Waterfall, old school, we spent a lot of time over here, and the myth was, now we understand it, the requirements are clear, so we just have to build it. But Taleb would say, if the future is not like the past, then your historical evidence isn't significant, and you should probably spend less time in discovery and more time learning. But I can't tell you what those numbers are. I can tell you for a lot of big programs I work in, if we spend more than 10% over here, it starts to feel very mythical to me, especially when the horizon goes out too far, because it's like we don't know what we don't know, and we get, that's how that mythical certainty or product arrogance grows. So here's a group of people using one of these maps. So this over here represents who, that's a vehicle. This is the map. This is a pretty big retail site. This person, these are all examples. So we were talking about in the open space upstairs, specification by example. This is how I do that same thing. It's not specification by example, but it's like choosing routes through the map based on what we want to learn in the forms of examples of the people that are going to validate it. And I love all that language, because that absolutely feels like, if delivery is a constant, then I get to go after that weird, ambiguous space. If I'm not sure if I'm delivering it for the right people, and I'm not sure what they want, but I'm pretty sure we should start by learning she's trying to do this, and to do that, she's going through that little path. That little red line is also how I started connecting with testers a long time ago, when there was divisions between groups. Is in multi-team situations, I found that, like, the test group was getting a bunch of stories delivered to them in a frequency of 10 days that didn't go together. Jeff Patton's joke for that always has been handing someone a bag of leaves and telling them there's a tree inside. And it's the tester's job to kind of rebuild the tree instead of kind of trying to deliver it, maybe a branch at a time, or whatever the right metaphor is. So that would be one. Another one that we've been doing that I think is really powerful is that a lot of people have spent their time talking about a sprint. So maybe traditionally there's some planning, stand up, stand up, stand up, review, retro, sort of rinse and repeat. And that's squarely kind of too often in this delivery space. But if you're trying to say, well, are we building the right thing? A lot of times the user experience doesn't fit neatly in a little 10-day bucket. It cuts across this. Now, I also didn't invent this. I met all sorts of people early on that were saying, when we were about 2 sprints ahead, then we were looking out a little bit farther. So this is an area, we've been setting up these design cadences. So we might, if this is a planning, let's just say real simple, this is Monday, this is Friday. We might set up a little cadence where the group of people that are getting together to say, do we have a good cohesive set of stories to tell? Can we walk through some meaningful user experiences? What is it that we want to validate? That group tries to go from, uncertainty to certainty in the form of expressing certainty in tests or sketches. And I could kind of go into that a little bit more, but this popped up for me primarily when there was multiple delivery teams down here. We had many teams trying to build one product, or many groups working in a system trying to validate a single user experience, because that's still a difficult problem to solve. So I just want to kind of close by showing you what this looks like. So This is a group of people, probably 60 all in. A smaller group of people got together, has a lot of different names. We're going to call them the product community. Because I hear them called a lot of different things. I used to hear them called like a group of people speaking with one voice. So they got their documents up there. They've been working on their documents here. They're still all jammed up. This is their training class right here. See if I have a shot of that. Yep, looks like that. Can you guys read that? You're all certified. It was a really simple thing to say, let's pick some examples, which is what's on the end of the table down here. So you pick some targets, people that are going to validate your idea, not necessarily users. There's one of those people. Here's some examples. They range from maybe simple and obvious to complex. We start with the simple and the obvious. She is trying to do this, and this group walks through and starts building one of these maps. Now, we've been trying to build this product called Cardboard to try and emulate this. And one of the biggest problems we have is what's powerful here is that look at these guys. They're all hanging out waiting for the product manager to tell them where it's at. They're sort of scared and sheepish. They can't tell the story yet. They want to. So you have this dude, he's the product manager. He's got some pretty serious hand-waving action going on. He's really passionate. Oh, it would be really cool if. He's got the context. He knows the market better than these people have maybe spent time building it. This dude is someone I would call a product-driven architect. He's working hard. He understands the technology. This is not a new system. There's lots of technical debt. It's not a well-tested system. He understands kind of the feasibility part. Marty Kagan's picture, which is represented in this room that I think is really smart, is the people you need in this discussion have these perspectives: valuable, usable, and feasible. He's the feasible person. He's not saying yes or no. It's a range. But it stops this one person, who's maybe the valuable person, from just dreaming randomly and producing a backlog that's a wish list. Making product choices is not fun or easy. Anybody raise your hand just out of curiosity if you're a product owner? Raise your hand. So keep your hands up. Keep your hand up if you think it's a super fun job and you feel really relaxed and you're always done early. Okay, yeah, that rarely, way to go, dude. You're Superman, apparently, yeah. That's pretty rare, and I think it's because it's not a singular concept. That's sort of a mistake, and I was reminded by Jeff Patton a while ago and another one of the Dev Jam coaches that when they learned Scrum, product owner was very different than how it's taught today. It was, I have an idea, and I'm going to throw it to you guys, and you're going to take ownership of it for a sprint. And I'm going to step away, but you own the idea. You don't blame me at the end of the sprint for not writing good stories. That's a little bit like, 1993 called and the requirements weren't clear. That's the same problem over and over again, instead of like that's where engineers become waiters. And this is the moment that's really hard to produce in a tool. In fact, so hard that we've been kind of experimenting with a pointer that shows when people are in physically, or some indicator to say someone else is trying to collaborate. Now, a lot of that collaboration in our tool happens when people are talking to each other, but that pointing is such a powerful, simple thing because the word people are using in English is this and that. And multiple people can touch the plan, and this is where I think ownership starts. The map is being built, people are telling the stories, and they're moving things around, and they're not scared to scrunch up one of these little Post-its because they're cheap. Because oftentimes when things go into tools, what happens is, first of all, one person is driving, so everybody isn't collaborating. A bunch of people are doing what you guys are doing, staring at the screen instead of looking at each other. And it's so much power that happens there. It's a really tough part of doing distributed kind of discovery like this. So now you can see the people that were sitting are now engaged. The vehicle of the mapping stuff is not a hard process. You can learn it very quick. This group, I literally taught it to them on the spot. I didn't even really make much ceremony about it. I just started visualizing their stories physically like this. And so more people are involved. More people are involved, the story gets told, it starts growing, and they get to the end, and someone always asks, when are you done? I can't answer that question for you, but I'll use some weird heuristics. The first answer of when you're done is when this product manager now gets up in front of this group. You could kind of pretend like these are multiple teams that are going to be building it. So what's really powerful here is this guy is now telling the big picture, the large story. So when discrete teams, however they're chopped up, whether they're feature teams or not, get a story in a sprint, the context is there. They've all been challenged to understand what's often missing, because I hear that metaphor from a lot of developers. I don't get the big picture. There's a tell there. That person can't make smart programming decisions when they don't understand the context. Then this product manager gets to the point where he hits the end of his discussion, and this architect, this product-driven architecture guy gets up, because he knows where the bodies are buried. He knows what you can and can't do. He knows the feasibility of some of this stuff, and he and other people in the room, he's not a wizard. The more people in the room that know that, the easier it is to kind of make those decisions. And that's the piece that I feel like is missing in an absolutely shameless moment of advertising, which I'm totally terrible at. This is the product we've built. Our joke is, if Google Docs and Post-it notes had a kid, it would look like cardboard, because it's made for distributed groups. They're trying to work together so one person can be in working on a map and just invite other people. And I've seen that like these kind of tools seem to be popping up all over the place, where people are trying to say, how do you do this kind of distributed design, visual thinking together? It's a tough space. Either that or we're just really bad at it. Certainly I'm bad at marketing, because I sat with someone yesterday who uses our product and he didn't even know that we built it. So I fail as a marketer, which I'm sort of proud of in a weird way. So I'm sure you're going to post the sessions. So I just added these questions in because these are the things I think this is more of what's interesting to me about Agile methods is when you start delivering, how do you use it as a vehicle for being more competitive? I think that language has always been there, but some of the weight that's accumulated has been around this certainty of we're building the right thing, and now it's this over-discussion about how good you are at Agile or not. These are the videos that he was talking about when he introduced me, and the first 3 are about coaching, and the next 3 are about kind of some of this product design and lean UX stuff. And the last 3 are me trying to kind of breathe new life into planning by calling it like planning to discover and planning to deliver. So I imagine from here we're going to retire to the bureauspective at some place. So I hope you guys enjoyed the conference.